Greetings, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well and you guys are in excellent health. So, we're going to be talking about part 2 in this American Revolution series, the causes of the American Revolution. So, one of the major causes of the American Revolution, as we mentioned in the previous video, was the reforms that Britain was trying to put into place at the end of the 7 Years' War as a means to kind of solidify and consolidate its empire. And so in 1760, we see King George III becoming the king, and he brings in not a new political party, but he brings in a political party that really had not been at the forefront of rule in like 30 years. And this was the Tories. And so the Tories were invested in an authoritarian empire where the colonies would simply just be subordinate. They would just do whatever the crown said, and that was it. And so we see this Tory influence with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. And so this was the first major post-war imperial action that targeted North America specifically. And so it forbade the settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains in an attempt to limit costly wars with indigenous peoples. So colonists protested this and demanded access to the territory because they were like, look, we fought alongside you, British folks. We deserve to have access to this land, especially as it is under the crown. Just 1 year later, you have Parliament passing 2 more reforms in 1764. So we see the Sugar Act as well as the Currency Act. So the Sugar Act attempted to combat this kind of widespread smuggling of molasses in New England by actually cutting the duty in half. And when we say duty, we simply mean a tax that is placed upon goods that are imported or exported. That's it. But we also see with the Sugar Act an increase in enforcement. So what this meant was that smugglers who were caught would be tried by Vice Admiralty courts, and they wouldn't be tried by juries, which was alarming to many American colonists or British American colonists, right? And we see the Currency Act restricting colonies from producing paper money. This was problematic for the colonists because hard money, such as gold or silver coins, was hard to come by in the colonies. They pretty much relied upon paper money. Also, the lack of currency kind of stifled the colonies' increasingly sophisticated transatlantic economies, right? And so this was particularly damaging in 1764, where there's a recession that's already beginning to hit, coming off the tail of the 7 Years' War. So then the following year, because Parliament just don't quit, so they passed the Stamp Act. And the Stamp Act required that many documents that were printed on paper had to be stamped to show the duty had been paid, including newspapers, pamphlets, diplomas, legal documents, and even playing cards. And so this created the first direct tax on specifically British colonial North Americans, right? Parliament had never directly taxed their colonists. Mind you, they might have adjusted a tax that was a duty that was already in place, but they never created anything new in terms of taxation. Prior to this, all of the taxes had been in the form of duties. The Stamp Act directly impacted numerous groups, far more than the Sugar Act, and it impacted people like printers, lawyers, college graduates, and even card-playing sailors. And because the Stamp Act impacted so many people, it inspired a large range protest. So resistance to the Stamp Act really took place in 3 forms that were largely tied to class, right? So you have the elite engaging in legislative resistance. We see economic resistance being conducted by the merchants, and then popular protests by commoners. And so one of the first acts of resistance we see coming from the elite, right, comes from the House of Burgesses in Virginia in May of 1765. They passed what was called the Virginia Resolves. And the Virginia Resolves basically declared that colonists were entitled to all rights and privileges and immunities as the people of Britain, because their thought process was this: hey, these taxes are not being applied to the people in Britain, but the Stamp Act applies to us, but we're British subjects, so why should this apply to us? This is ridiculous. The Virginia House of Resolves was printed throughout the colonies and mass distributed, and in the process of it being distributed, there were additional radical addendums that were not approved of or passed by the House of Burgesses. However, these radical additions really inspired a language of patriotism amongst these British American colonists. We also see the Stamp Act Congress being convened. And so the Stamp Act Congress was an assembly in New York City in October of 1765 to discuss the Stamp Act. 9 colonies sent delegates. People such as Benjamin Franklin, for example, were in attendance. The Stamp Act Congress issued a Declaration of Rights and Grievances, which declared allegiance to the king and to Parliament. But it also reasserted this idea that colonists were entitled to the same rights as Britons, such as trial by jury, which they were not getting, especially under the Sugar Act, right? And it also argued the right to be taxed only by their elected representative. And so Parliament and the Crown argued that colonists were being, quote unquote, virtually represented. So there were counties and boroughs in Britain that did not elect members to Parliament, yet they didn't have a problem, so why should the British colonists? We also see economic resistance. So merchants in major port cities also refused to import British goods. There were convenings that took place to kind of organize these efforts. So in New York City, more than 200 merchants agreed to not import, sell, or buy goods from Great Britain. In Philly, merchants gathered at a general meeting and agreed not to import British goods until the act was repealed. And this helped to inspire British merchants to lobby for the repeal of the Stamp Act, which they were successful. It totally did. So by January 1766, London merchants sent a letter to Parliament in protest of their lost earnings, because they're saying, hey, these American colonists aren't taking our stuff. Please repeal this act because it's not good for business. And then finally, we see popular protests. Riots broke out all over Boston. Crowds hung Andrew Oliver, who was the appointed stamp distributor for Massachusetts. They hung him in effigy and also demolished a building that he owned. Oliver, smart man, decided to resign the next day. The next week, a crowd destroyed the home of Oliver's brother-in-law, who was the lieutenant governor. His name was Thomas Hutchinson. And they destroyed his home because he had argued for the submission to the stamp tax. And by November 16th, all of the original 12 stamp distributors in the colonies had resigned. And by 1766, we see organizations being created like the Sons of Liberty. And these groups were designed to organize and direct further resistance actions. And with no one to distribute the stamps, the act became completely unenforceable, right? And so the Stamp Act was repealed in February of 1766. But with that, Parliament couldn't help itself and passed the Declarator Act, which stated that Parliament had the full power and authority to make laws that would impact the colonies, including acts similar to the Stamp Act or to the Sugar Act. But the colonists at the time were so pleased with themselves for getting the Stamp Act repealed that they really kind of overlooked the Declarator Act. So I'm going to pause this here. Please stay tuned for the next segment in the American Revolution. Have a good one.